Welcome to the Renaissance Woodworker. This is my shop update for March 17th, 2017. Here's what's happening in my shop this week. I finished up this guy. It's called a Ramtang. It's a Dutch joiner's appliance that really is meant for cutting window sash. As I understand it correctly, Ramtang translated means window pliers. It's kind of like a Moxon vise in the fact that it's got two jaws that clamp stuff together, but it is infinitely more powerful. I just finished it, and just in the last couple of days since I finished it, playing around with it, I've discovered a lot of cool stuff that it can do. Last week I cut a through mortise, and I specifically chopped it out because I wanted to draw attention to how the wedging action of a mortise chisel really does the job for you, and it doesn't require walloping on it with a mallet. Well, invariably, as I expected, questions came up about, well, could you also cut that through mortise by boring it out? This week, I'm going to show you how I would cut a through mortise, not by chopping it out, by boring out the waste and then paring it. And I'll get to actually use the Ramtang and show it off a little bit while we cut this mortise. Here are my basic reasons for wanting to bore out a through mortise rather than chopping out. A, it could be that it's really, really long and there's just a lot of chopping that I could bore through faster. Or it's a really hard wood that's going to be really tough on my chisels. And it's just going to be a heck of a lot of work to try to chop through something that I could bore through when it's quite a bit harder. C, and probably the most important, is if it's in a size that just doesn't make sense. I have 1/4 inch, 3/8 inch mortise chisels. I have one 1-inch mortise chisel that's meant for timber framing, and that is a really difficult thing to drive. Generally, when you get bigger than a 3/8 inch mortise chisel, you're starting to get on diminishing returns. That huge amount of steel to try to chop into the wood just takes a lot of effort, can be really hard on the steel, the chisel steel, can be hard on the wood itself. So more often than not, if you've got a mortise that needs to be wider than 3/8, or it needs to be 6 inches wide for like timber framing, it just ends up being easier to bore it out and then pare it back to the lines. This piece of cherry is probably at the bottom end of what I would consider doing a through mortise. It's what, about 2.5 inches wide. So yeah, that's a fairly deep mortise, but it's not that deep. I'm gonna just go ahead and put a 3/8 inch mortise in here. Just recognize that I might actually be able to chop this faster than I would be able to bore it. We'll see. So the first thing I need to do is lay it out. I've got my mortise gauge set to the width of my mortise chisel here. And I'm just going to eyeball the center. That looks about right. Slide my fence up and lock that in place. I'll go ahead and mark this as my reference face so that I keep the fence against that reference face. Flip it in for end, again using the fence against that same reference face. I'll mark the mortise on the other side. Now when I'm boring it out, it's really helpful to have a center line. Certainly I can come in here and I can position the auger bit kind of in the center and go, that looks good, and bore it out. But every single time I do that, I've got to reposition it again. Moreover, when you flip it, you kind of lose your bearings a little bit, and you might have more trouble getting those holes that you bore from either side to line up. So having a center line that you can work off of and you can consistently reference the point of the auger bit in it will make things a heck of a lot easier. But getting it exactly center could also pose its own problems. So what I do again is just kind of eyeball the center of that mortise. Lock that down. I'm going to make a little mark here. I'm going to flip the board around and make a mark from the opposite face. Now I've got two lines now that are separated by, I don't know, maybe a little bit more than 1/16 of an inch. What I want to do now is split that distance . I find that just by wrapping the gauge on the bench, I can get finer adjustments. This doesn't have a micro adjust on it. If you have micro adjust, that certainly makes things a lot easier. Now I'll flip it again, and I can see that I'm almost dead center there. But here's the thing. I'm going to stack the cards in my favor, and it doesn't have to be exactly center. It's just got to be close. So let me go ahead and mark a center line here. Again, referencing off the same reference face with the fence. I'll lay in that center in both faces. Now I'm making a 3/8 inch mortise, so I should grab a 3/8 inch auger bit. Well, that expects that I will be exactly in the center. So instead what I'm going to do is downsize by 1. Instead of a number 6 auger, 3/8, I've gone down to a number 5 or 5/16 auger. It's just going to give me that extra 32nd of an inch play on either side of the bit. And that's really all I need. As long as I'm really close on the center, but not exact, that's fine. Let me go ahead and mark the extents here. I'm not doing any particular, fitting any particular, whatchamacallit, tenon, so let's just arbitrarily throw some lines in here. Saddle square is really useful here. I find that that's where most of the inaccuracies in through tenons come from, is something slips during the layout or something doesn't line up exactly during the layout, and you end up with a mortise being ever so slightly wider on one end or the other. Now, as you can see, I can come in here, drop the auger bit in that center line, and as I just take a couple test rotations, I can see that the wings are staying inside my, my layout here. And before I start cutting, there's even a faster shortcut for that center line layout. When you have the extents in the mortise laid out, you can just use the auger bit. Come in with the auger bit, set it so the wings are inside those lines, tilt it up and kind of use the point just to make a mark. That may not be the center, but you know that that mark has the bit entirely inside there. And then I can set my gauge to that little divot I made and go from there. It's a heck of a lot faster than kind of futzing around, moving it back and forth. But there will be times when you want things to be exactly center, and that process that I showed is very valid there as well. So now I'm going to bore through from both sides. So I'm going to set my bit on my center line so that I am maybe a 1/16 to an 1/8 of an inch away from the ends. And you want to bore straight here. I'm going to be boring from both sides, but I don't want to deviate one way or another, or you'll end up with a crooked mortise. So I find the best way to do that is to actually place my forehead on the pad. I can sight down it, and I can very clearly see if I deviate one way or the other, or front or back. I've got blue tape as my depth stop here. And it's set to a little bit more than half the width of this board. When the blue tape sweeps away the dust, I know that I'm there. Now I can, again, set it right on that center line and continue to cut. Now you have to be careful in your spacing here. With an auger bit, it will tend to want to walk. If you put it too close, it will probably wander into this other hole. So I tend to shoot for just the tiniest bit of kind of webbing, connective tissue between the holes, and invariably that little connective tissue kind of breaks away in the process of boring it out. Now this is something that you're only going to find in harder woods. If you're working in softwoods, pine, or even softer hardwoods, like basswood or butternut or something like that, the softer woods will deform a little bit more, and your drill bit will have a tendency to walk around on you just a bit more. The harder the wood, the more you can stack your holes right on top of one another. And you can see I left just a little bit of connective tissue, and by the time I bored to the bottom, it's now gone. Those holes are actually connected. So you get a feel for this and exactly how far to space them apart. Obviously, the closer you can get them together, the less crap you've got to remove later. I'm using a lightweight brace here. It's a 6-inch swing, so there's not as much leverage as you would find over your typical 10-inch or 12-inch swing brace, but I'm also only drilling out a 3/8 inch hole, so it doesn't take a lot of torque. If you're drilling
like dog holes in your bench, you're going to want at least a 10-inch swing, or you're just going to be working way too hard. But I do find that for these smaller holes, having this more shallow swing, it actually allows me to bore a little bit straighter. With a wider swing, obviously, the more your arm is kind of deviating and the more rock you can possibly impart into the brace. So the tighter rotation helps me to keep things straighter. That could all be in my imagination too, honestly. All right, I should be able to get one last hole here. If you still are finding or having a lot of trouble with your bits wandering on you, you probably need to stop and sharpen them. Fair amount of schmutz in there, but that should come out as we bore out the rest of it. So let me flip this over, slot my wedge back in place, and I will repeat this on the other side. And the real test is as you're boring this through, at some point you should feel it kind of give way and break through. It tells you you're lined up on your other hole. You should also notice that I'm boring a significantly shallower hole here because my depth stop actually runs quite a bit past the center point, the halfway point rather. Now you may find one of the most difficult things about boring this out is just kind of getting out some of the accumulated waste from boring it out. It can get wedged in there pretty tight. My scratch awl does a really good job of just kind of breaking it out, getting it out of the way. I'm going to grab a nice wide chisel, and I just want to line up on the points left between the holes and pare that away. On the ends, I'm going to do this just like I were chopping it out. I'm just going to work my way back. I find this one area where the ram ting does fall short a little. When you do start to pound on here, those wedges can come out. That may be because this is a, fairly new appliance, and maybe I need to rough up the finish a little bit on the wedges. But you can actually see this wedge kind of shifting out a little bit as I'm chopping. Not to the end of the world, because the jaws themselves still hold things in place very nicely. Set the wide chisel in my line. Sight down here. And again, just like the boring process, I'm tapping my way to the halfway point, and I'll come at it from both sides. Okay, let's flip it over and repeat the paring process from the other side. Now as I put my chisel right on my knife line, step back and sight down, just some light taps, and you should feel it kind of break through as it goes to the other side. It connects up with your other chisel, and that's the indicator that you've got it square, you've got it straight up and down and plumb. If it continues to kind of pose resistance all the way through to the other side, you're probably undercutting, or maybe you undercut the other side. And there we go. It pops through. And to be fair, there's nothing wrong with undercutting this slightly. Slightly. If you undercut too much, you don't have that glue contact that you can get with a straight wall. So at this point, the main part of the walls are done. you can just kind of come in and clean up any fuzzies that are down in there. But I really just need to finish chopping the end walls where I stayed away with the auger bit originally. But now there's all kinds of space for that wood to wedge into. So you can take some pretty heavy duty bites here, just working your way down. Okay, set that right in the knife line. Step back, check we're square. Check we're plumb that way. And that connected up. So I should have a through mortise now.
And if we look in there, you can see we do. You may end up with just some little kind of clingers right in the corners and need to come back and pare it away. But ultimately, you should have a relatively smooth wall interior like that. There's nothing really in the way as I sight right down in there. You can also grab a square, and by setting the square and kind of tweaking it, you can run it up and down, and you can sight in there and see that the straight edge is actually hitting both walls. I've got a nice straight wall. And certainly running it up and checking that these walls, the in walls, are square as well. So as you can see, the process is pretty similar. You're just removing the bulk of the waste with the auger bit, and you're still following some of the same practices to square it up to those lines that we used when we chopped the whole thing out. The question is this a time saver or not? On a piece like this, I don't really think so. This probably actually took a little bit longer than it would have taken for me to just chop it out. Where this really comes into bear is when you've got really wide mortises, things that are 1 inch, 2, 3 inches wide, like if you're doing on a workbench or something, and you can use much bigger auger bits to hog out huge amounts of material. But it's another valid method, and it can be a little bit safer than the chopping method because so much of that waste is bored out with a brace, and because the brace and the auger gives you such a long axis, it's really easy to judge whether or not you're square. Just trust yourself. Put your forehead on the pad and you'll be surprised at how straight you can bore a hole. So that's it for me this week, folks. Thanks for watching.